1999, the Cleveland Spiders finished with a record of 20 wins and 134 losses, making them possess the technically worst record in baseball history. The 1875 Brooklyn Athletics technically have an even worse record since they finished 2-42, but they weren't necessarily considered a major league team. The 1916 Philadelphia Athletics, finishing at 36-117, have the worst winning percentage since 1900, making them the worst team in the modern era. None of these teams, however, can be considered the worst team in history because they all played in the dead ball era and all did not play a minimum of 162 games. The dead ball era came to a close in 1920 and teams began playing 162 total games in 1962. So now that we have our criteria, which team can be considered the worst of all time? As always, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe. Before we announce the worst team of all time, I thought I can give some quick stats on the rest of MLB's losing teams over the years. The 1909 Washington Senators finished with 42 wins, ranking 7th worst of all time, but they managed to somehow lose 29 games in a single month of July, which is naturally the worst. 1909 must have been a tough year to watch, as the Boston Doves finished with 45 wins, but also finished 65.5 games out of first place in their division, which marks the biggest first place lead of all time. The 1908 St. Louis Cardinals may have finished with 49 wins, but they scored the least amount of runs in a single season in MLB history, tallying only 372 and averaging 2.42 per game. To put that into perspective, the Detroit Tigers scored the least amount of runs in the league in 2022 and still averaged a full 1 run more than the Cardinals did that year. The 1935 Boston Braves finished with the least amount of wins in the live ball era with 38, but they only played in 153 games. In 1962, the MLB enacted the 162 game schedule, and coincidentally, the Mets finished with the second worst record in modern baseball history by going 40-120, but they actually did not play in 162 games. The reason being, the MLB was not fully incorporated into the American and National League as we know it today until 1969. In the silly number year, the MLB added 4 new expansion teams, which prompted the league to add divisions to each league, which then forced each league to always reach 162 games no matter what. Before then, if a team was doing poorly and games got rained out that had no consequence, they just simply wouldn't make up the game. In 1988, the Baltimore Orioles set a record for losing the most games to start a season, failing to win 21 in a row. Funny enough, 30 years later, the Orioles would once again be terrible. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the 2018 Baltimore Orioles. The 2018 Baltimore Orioles finished their season with a record of 47 wins and 115 losses. Now, this is not the worst record in history. However, they could have been the worst team if not for a couple of randomly timed wins. The 2018 Cy Young Award winner, Blake Snell, gave up 5 runs to the 2018 Orioles on May 13th, and the Orioles won somehow 7-1. I don't know. The Orioles also had Chris Davis, who broke the major league record for worst batting average in 2018, hitting an abysmal 168 and even going 0 for 54 at one point. Even so, there were 2 games the Orioles won by 2 runs, where Chris Davis also scored 3 RBIs, which feels like they should have also lost these games. They also won 3-16 against the Red Sox, but somehow managed to defeat them 10-3 in their last matchup of the season. Smells kind of fishy. If we tally up the fraudulent wins that I've come up with for the 2018 Orioles, they really should have won 43 games, which would have tied them for the worst record in baseball history, but that record goes to the following team. My oh my, the 2003 Detroit Tigers were trash. Okay, we finally got here. After trudging through miles and miles of garbage, we have finally arrived at the worst team of all time, the 43-119 2003 Detroit Tigers. The Tigers lost 6-5 to the Angels on August 22nd, which put their record at 31-96 and set the record for fastest playoff elimination before the 2018 Orioles broke it on August 20th. You might say the Tigers had a good excuse since they were run by a first-year manager in Alan Trammell. But the Diamondbacks had a first-year manager in 2001, and guess what? They won the World Series. There were a couple issues that boiled up over time for the Tiger squad that eventually reared its ugly head in 2003. Their farm system was truly awful, and it was on full display. As almost every other game, management was shuffling players in and out from AAA, mainly from the Toledo Mud Hens, the same Toledo Mud Hens that Moneyball manager Billy Beane actually played for, but I guess his managerial skills hadn't quite yet blossomed at that time. The Tigers' pitching was also quite horrendous. The entire staff combined for a disgusting 5.3 ERA while allowing a whopping 929 total runs on the season, which ranks 23rd worst of all time. Even crazier is that the Tigers had 3 starting pitchers amass at least 17 losses each, and they collectively became the first trio in history to be on the same team while simultaneously leading the league in losses at 1, 2, and 3. Their hitting was just as bad, if not worse. The Tigers batted .240 on the season, which was a full 19 points below the American League average. Just like the 2018 Baltimore Orioles, though, the 2003 Tigers actually could have been much worse, if not for a few interesting events. The team's best hitter was Dmitry Young, who batted a respectable .297 and blasted 29 bombs, but this was by far the best season of his career, and he finished with a WAR that was a full 2 games higher than his career average, so maybe they could have lost more if Young played, as he literally played any other year. Shane Halter, the team's usual 7-hole hitter, batted a nice .217 on the year and finished with 30 RBIs, but he did have one game on April 12th against the White Sox where he scored 3 RBIs, a game the Tigers would win 4-3, which was also the Tigers' only win in their first 18 games of the season, and it also happened to be against Josh Stewart, a pitcher who would only be in the big leagues for 2 years total. On June 3rd, the Tigers faced off against the Padres and won 3-2, all thanks to a go-ahead 3-run bomb in the 9th inning from the aforementioned Dmitry Young. Dmitry would only hit 1 home run in the 9th inning all year. That was it. The wildest part about the 2003 Tigers is that 156 games into the season, they were 38-118 and were amidst a 10-game losing streak, but they went on a tear to end the season by winning 5 of their last 6. Their main bulk of wins at the end came against the Minnesota Twins, who were 48 games ahead of the Tigers. 48 games! 40, and they also sat all of their main starters for their series to prepare for the postseason. If the Tigers had lost one more game, they'd have tied the 1962 Mets in losses in the modern era, but they somehow came back on the Twins down 8-0 to win 9-8 in the second to last game of the season. So for all you counting out there, if we take away Dmitry Young's outlier season, Shane Halter's random day of greatness, and an extremely arbitrary comeback against a Twins team who had 50 more wins, the Tigers really should have finished 2003 with the record of 38-124. Yikes!